The Butterfly's Dream by Cerberus 314 at Chapter 12, Tatalinus. Chapter 12, Tautologist. Again, those words had been her cadence for as long as she could remember. Her life Kirinike sonata, in which each day overlapped the one before, so two becomes one endless song of hard work. Right, this time was a different tune, from the way her muscles protested vehemently against her jerking movements, to the impossible pull of gravity on her petite frame, which bled into her very will to go on. For this time her drive was external, a different conductor leading the beat. Come on, Ruby, get up. The voice was no longer familiar, no longer the friendly encouragement or even a light teasing of her skills to light a fire underneath her. It was cold, harsh, decrying the reality of all the veteran huntsman had been witness to. Trying, the words were his reality, and the way the world was outside of her dreamlike life, the way it was in the life of her dreams. She just thought she'd have more time before that happened to her. 5 minutes. Given reprieve, she let herself collapse back onto the dusty ground, once soft grass and now trampled bare from their near constant spars. She might have dozed off, but couldn't tell and didn't much care. Naruto would wake up in his bed in the middle of the night for all of 5 minutes, long enough to scribble off a quick note from the pad on his bedside table and go back to sleep. He had always been one to solve his problems directly. This was still true now, as he would take out a lot of his frustrations with little being able to help Ruby through his own brutal training regimen. But after a galling long time, he'd been forced to own up to his impotence and watch instead with eyes unclouded by anger. He wasn't doing himself or his partner any favors otherwise. He'd observed the change in her uncle, the difference in the way he went about her training. Gone was the nurturing, borderline pandering attitude he'd adopted at first, where each step she took forward was met with equal parts soft praise and stern reinforcements. It wasn't like they had not expected it after the incident on the field trip, figured that it shocked her guardians into trying to toughen her up, fear of losing her entirely overriding that of destroying her innocence. This mode had continued for many weeks now. Crow should have lightened up on her, but hadn't. Crow was scared. That was what Naruto had tried to relate to her. But of what? There he could offer no help. All right, that's enough rest. Let's get back at it. Blue eyes blinked into silver, blinked back into darkness. Could she even get up? Her arms were already testing this theory before she was fully awake, following instinctively the command from the elder huntsman. A pained sigh, a strong arm under her jelly ones. All right, I think we're done for today. No, I can still go on. Yeah, I know you can. Just give an old man a chance to rest, will ya? There it was, the light sarcasm and wry humor which had been absent for so long. It was wanting even now, lackluster in its delivery and strained just like her muscles, as she was lightly jostled up and down. The words scrawled hastily on that yellow paper entered her mind. What exactly was it that her uncle was afraid of? Surely Patch was in no danger any time soon. Its isolation had protected them for decades, centuries now. Furthermore, she still had several years to go in Signal, where she would get far stronger, strong enough that she would be more than capable by the time she set off on her own in the great big world of Vale. Besides, didn't he know that fear would attract Grim? It was real. He'd always been an early riser, sunrise being a daily vitamin. He scarfed alongside a quick breakfast of milk and cereal before training. This time it was early. He didn't care to read the crimson numbers on his bedside clock and settled for the qualifying fact that his tiny apartment was still totally black. There was no use to going back to sleep though, and so he got up and started his day. He thought better on his feet anyway, always had, and so while his body went on autopilot, unhurriedly going about daily absolutions and settling the kettle to boil for tea, his mind wandered to the ground who normally occupied this time of the day and the majority of his thoughts. Once again, he wished that he could help Ruby further, but also came to the same conclusion, same as before, that the best way to do that would be to provide her an example, suffer along with her as he pushed himself to exhaustion in his own training. He could think of nothing to help her with Crow. His only experience with those kinds of familial bonds was through her, and both were equally lost. He had to focus on other things, had decisions to make in his own life as well, but then it wasn't like they were real choices anyway. Naruto and his team would wander back into the village after the mission in Wave, weary and still feeling like their heads were lost in the mist. Things had been so surly since they began that he was wondering if it wasn't the type of dreams people talked about. Zabuza was dead as much as he could be this time. Despite Yamato giving his word to take care of the boy, he let the swordsman's apprentice disappear into the dense forest in the land of Wave. Haku was clearly more than capable of taking care of himself, slipping in with some local populace far away where no one knew his name, face, gender, or cruel history. This could be considered a sad ending to an equally sad episode. But in the end, it was just a hollow feeling to be filled by the news Yamato had for them once they were safely behind the gates. He was recommending them for the Chunin exams, convinced that after a full year of working together, they had not only improved enough individually, but as a team as well. Naruto had to objectively agree with him, but was he ready? That was a question he'd yet to answer, but would have to soon. Supposing that was another reason he pushed himself so hard next to Ruby, to make sure he didn't fall behind, to make sure that he wouldn't let anyone else down. So you decided to show up? He cocked an eyebrow quizzingly. Was there ever any doubt? Neji smirked. Come on. Tenten's waiting for us. There was both excitement and competitiveness in there. It was heartening and off-putting at the same time, but ultimately moot. There you guys are. We're not late. A doubtful look to the other boys. Are we? Neji rolled his pupilless eyes, not deigning to answer the obvious. Tenten was just teasing them. He should have known that. He had known that. Yeah, yeah, don't you know perfect takes time. We can't all just roll out of bed looking beautiful like pretty boy here. He nudged his senior Genin, who gave him an annoyed but tolerant look. It was in fact Naruto who winced, abashed by how blatant he was trying to divert the topic away from him, from his own preoccupation. He tried his best to forget his distraction for now, let Ruby mull over it instead, while fighting with her uncle drained her physically and mentally. That was a different kind of concentration. She could afford to spend the leftover brain power on this. He needed to reserve what little he had on the upcoming test. She would try, but it was hard to know her partner's internal thoughts these days. Without a doubt, his reservations had something to do with the task ahead, but beyond that, she could not deny a sixth sense present within her own consciousness, either absorbed from the body she now occupied, or else brought over from her waking hours. After being lost in these thoughts for a short jaunt down the hallway, she found herself when Naruto did, amongst the gaggle of fellow Konoha ninja in a non-script examination room. Safe territory, relatively speaking. They did not know two-thirds of the people by now, and had reservations about any number of their supposed allies. One in particular caught the attention of the two souls, but it shouldn't have been a surprise because the elder Genin managed to attract quite a bit of attention to himself overall, waving around his dangerous cards carelessly. The glasses-wearing ninja was absently added to a separate list in the two minds, but he could not be spared any more thoughts as that boy passed through their sight. Ruby and Naruto, by proxy, had become especially sensitive to darker emotions because of their danger around Grim. Up close, the teen was a wellspring, nay, a tar pit of the stuff, threatening anyone near him to become mired in that dangerous logic and gloomy outlook. Except that is for two girls whom they recognized from the same fateful day, who were totally inured to the emotional thanks to the one-way protective mirror of vanity. They clung on to the Uchiha Shion like mosquitoes. To protect himself and his passenger, Naruto steered far away from that human bug zapper. Anyone seen Lee? His instant question would not be answered until much, much later, not until two of the tests had gone by and the unconventional team had similarly numerous obstacles, including tasks which tested both their teamwork and patience. There would be close calls, some which could be considered mildly humorous to outside observers, or after much retrospective, such as when during the first exam Tenten tried to wake Naruto up from his nap with a kunai and narrowly missed getting ejected, which would spur a chuckle out of Ruby who was helping him to cheat, or later with the blonde's infamous incident with the second exam proctor, though himself in that scary situation. It was funny for Naruto as he pictured Ruby's reaction to the snake lady trying to drink his blood, fear beaten by humor, but this was the only there was the only lightheartedness to be found, for everything else they found came with something heavy attached. To their credit, they passed each of their tests solidly in the middle of the pack. Quite the achievement if one considers the obstacles in their way, but this went unappreciated by Neji, and because of him, as he revealed in due course, so that he had yet to completely turn over a new leaf. This revelation spoiled most of the accomplishments they would celebrate. Ruby would further be confronted with the cruelty of the ninja world in that time, fights to the death between comrades, between friends and family, cold-blooded assassins looming in every corner, monsters which rivaled grim in ferocity, and hate, anger, betrayal, intense feelings she never even considered possible, and to her shame, some of them came from her, but there was also no shortage of it in the other participants. It was written across the faces of the Ame ninjas who tried to ambush them. It resounded in every blow as Neji struck down his cousin, and it drowned the forest when it exploded from the raven-haired boy in a visible torrent, darkness spreading across his skin like a plague. Each had such malice in their eyes, every one of them, and now, though she could not see its reflection, it was there in the eyes of her partner as he glared at his hands, which were useless to stop any of it. Why? Why couldn't I do anything? What was all that training for if I just have to sit by and let things happen? For once, Ruby could not tell if Naruto was speaking to himself or to her. He must have known she hadn't an answer, but needed to hear something in that resounding silence. It was horrible to feel as so helpless. What made it unbearable was the fact that they both did. More than ever, she wished she could reach across the cosmos and embrace him, hold him, and have him hold her, assuring them both that everything was going to be all right. The lone beeping of a heart monitor was poor company. "She's going to be all right, you know." The toneless voice of Yamato drifted in over his shoulder unreassuringly. It was a sanctioned match, and the proctor stopped it when he could. "I know," Naruto answered in an even monotone. They both knew. They both had learned so many things during their time together, and yet, knowing did little to prepare them for the inevitable. It was one thing when it happened to an enemy, it was another when it happened to a friend. "Why?" Naruto began. Why do you think she did that? Why did she have to be so cruel when she had already won? It wasn't like that Sand Ninja was showing off her skills to anyone who cared. She was just the perfect adversary for Tenten. The wind techniques negating all of the girl's hard-won skills with weapons. That Tamara girl, they both wanted to know what made her so callous, if only to sate the feeling of being otherwise powerless to help their teammate. Yamato hummed as he gazed over his shoulder. "Some say meanness is something that is taught. I don't believe that. I feel that everyone has a little bit in them and only need something to draw it out." It was something they suspected, heard before, but found hard to believe. What could do that to a person? Indeed, what? "Fear," came the one-word response. Naruto turned in his seat so that he and Ruby could see the faraway look in the Jonin's eye. Fear, that could do it. They'd both felt fear before, known of its omnipresence back in Wave. They had been able to overcome it those times, but each time had been more potent, harder to resist. What of in the forest of death, when confronted with it in corporal form, fear made him want to strike the possessed Sasuke down before he hurt any of his friends. Fear made Ruby want to do the same. How long would they be able to resist its beck and call? "What is she so afraid of?" he asked again to someone, and everyone listened. He looked his own fear straight in the face. Tintin lay there with bruises and swelling disfiguring her robust beauty. Treated cuts covered her body. He was scared of her, scared of losing her, and he wanted to hate the one responsible. But fear, did fear make those feelings excusable? If ever there was something to be afraid of, that red-headed sand ninja was it, and to think he was her brother, that thought rattled his very concept of kin. He was scared of just thinking about that cold, cold stare. There wasn't even any hate, and so there was nothing to relate to. He could understand her fear. He couldn't fathom that. That didn't excuse it. Ruby had been scared facing the griffin. She had been scared when confronted with the change in her uncle, and throughout it all he had been scared for her. But did she lash out to anyone? No, never. Fear drove them to get stronger, to protect those they cared about. Upon seeing that strength fail him now, Naruto could understand where other options might be appealing. Sasuke grew unendingly stronger with his hate, as did Neji, but he wouldn't do that to Ruby, would not settle her with that burden, nor betray himself with entertaining it. I'll get stronger, Tenten. I promise. He grabbed her unconscious hand and squeezed it gently. Ruby idly marveled at how she never noticed how similar their hands were, how incredibly small even compared to Naruto's. Once you're out of here, we'll both get stronger. Will you be all right? His sensei deigned to ask after giving the boy ample time. Naruto nodded. Okay, if you need me for something, don't be afraid to contact the other Jonin sensei. They'll know how to reach me. Where will you be? Naruto asked after digesting the words, catching Yamato before he left the room. I think Neji and I need another talk. Is she going to be all right? He repeated the question, suddenly remembering that his teammate was not the only one injured. Satisfied that Tenten was going to be okay for now, and suddenly remembering his other priority, that and he could not bear to look at her unconscious pain anymore. That girl, Neji's uncle, Neji's cousin, is she going to make it? She knew through first-hand experience just how dangerous the seemingly gentle strikes could be, and did not envy the girl being on the receiving end of such a brutal onslaught. Aye, he feared for her too. You mean Hinata? It was the first time he had seen the man frown, the weights dragging the corners of his mouth down just below level. That's my next step, he confessed. Naruto nodded in resignation, not understanding. Either his instructor didn't know, or he wanted to spare him the bad news. If he was reasoning that Naruto might extract revenge on his vindictive teammate, he could not blame the man for thinking so. He did want to. His prior talk with Neji had been for naught. That further incensed him. Given the importance he placed with words, the reassuring issue had already almost come to blows again. It was guaranteed that it would eventually. He was eager for it. Part of him wanted to make sure Neji couldn't make that mistake again. Part of him wanted to exact punishment in proportion to the crime. Naruto stopped himself by remembering his own foolish mistake, the fact that he, despite being the one person who should know better, had made them too. The difference was that he was trying to correct them. He resolved to cure the hatred in everyone, starting with his teammate, one step at a time. But in the following silence, Ruby was left to wondering the same thing as Yamato for a while longer. She had to question if Naruto's frustration would lead him down that path of no return. She knew the boy so much more intimately and still trusted her otherworldly sibling to do the right thing, though it did not stop her from worrying. When he made it all the way home without letting his thoughts be known, she began to feel the tug of doubt, but she managed to keep it under wraps throughout his solitary dinner and his evening routine, silence overbearing it all. She was not unused to his more reactant movements of contemplation. When he would go from a bright and cheery boy to a statue, it was partly her fault anyway. It was still worrying when he crawled into bed without uttering a word or scribbling her a quick note of reassurance. She let out a sigh of relief when he reached over to the eternal pad of paper by his bedside and deliberately engraved two words in the page so forcefully they might have permanently marked the cardboard backing. The light went out and Naruto closed his eyes, sealing the two of them off from the world. But even as she opened them on her end, the characters were etched into her eyes like a sunspot. Love, hate, fear. Fear of the unknown. Ruby had been scared of the first day of classes at Signal. She had been scared when her uncle began acting strangely. She had been scared when first confronted with that someone who was her but wasn't. These fears were easily conquered. They were beaten with time, with knowledge. It was no different it was no different now as she was led on the unfamiliar streets of Vale. The city loomed large, imposing and impersonal compared to Patch. It was full of unknowns. Around every corner a new danger prowled until she confronted it, but she soldiered on without complaint because she knew it was fleeting until she learned how to deal with it all. She would come to deal with it. This was that thought which gave her strength. Also imagining the dazzled look on Naruto's face as he gazed upon skyscrapers for the first time through her eyes would give her immeasurable joy, even more delight than seeing it for herself. So, as Naruto faced his ninja trial, Ruby embarked on a different sort of adventure. It would be foolish to think of it as any less important, any less dangerous. Pitfalls lurked in the big cities. There was no question of that. Grim were not enough of a deterrent to keep people from doing horrid things to one another. Why could they not see the continued cycle of hatred? How could they not understand that it would had led to the destruction? These were questions for another time. Dad, can we get something to eat? I'm hungry. That was an appropriate question, though Ruby giggled at the delivery. What? Just a minute ago you were bored out of your mind trying to get us to let you go off on your own, which, by the way, is still not happening. Yang grumbled something about taking off with her license, when she got it, of course, but underneath the scrutinizing eyes of her father peering over the wrinkled map, she covered up her seditious language. That was then and this is now, and I was hungry back then too, but you wouldn't let me go off with my friends, so now I'm starving. After more of their disagreements, their stomachs settled the question and directed them to a rudimentary noodle stand with enticing smells wafting out from the slowly rotating pressed metal air vent. Well, not exactly what I had pictured for a celebratory meal, but I guess it's not bad. Hmm? Mm, not got no complaints out of me. Yang, what have I told you about talking with your mouth full? Say it, don't spray it. The wad of noodles traveled down a lump in her throat as she swallowed and wiped her broth splattered face before letting out a satisfying burp and digesting back in. Wait, celebrating? Oh, come on. You can't tell me you forgot you aced the combat test. You got the best score in the history of Signal. Dad's assistant is going to be out of it for at least a week. Ruby shrugged sheepishly and turned back to playing with her noodles, suddenly not feeling overly hungry despite the thought of Naruto chiding her for wasting perfectly good food. You should really take more pride in your grades, Ruby, her father admonished, slipping into his role as a teacher. Why? The blond father of two was taken aback by the genuine and unexpected question. Because grades are a reflection on your performance, and many people will look at them through your life to judge what kind of person you are. Ruby frowned, now pushing the bowl of noodles away from her. She had completely lost her appetite. A letter, one letter, ascribed by someone who may or may not sympathize or understand you. She was lucky to have her father as a teacher, but many others were not his children. Could he claim to know them as well? Did he feel confident enough to judge their character with a simple stroke of a pen? She had never really thought about it before, but it hardly seemed fair. It was that sort of generalization which condemned Naruto for so long. Worse, it seemed to perpetuate the same sort of misunderstanding that hate did. Both were reactions to the unquestionable. That's dumb, Ruby declared matter-of-factly, studying the other two who nearly fell off their bar stools. I don't really care how people see me. I want to do good, not to be told I am good. I want to use my strength to protect people. I don't need to show it or my grades off to anyone to know who I am. Taeyang was torn with being aghast and being proud of his youngest daughter for taking such a mature/naive viewpoint. Really, he should have learned to expect these sorts of outbursts from the daughter of Summer Rose by now, but she always managed to dredge up new ways to surprise him. He wanted to support her, truly he did. But if bursting her bubble was the best way to keep her from messing up her future, that was a fair price to pay. I must say that is a rather interesting way to look at it. His finger raised and his mouth poised to say something, yet he was prompt as a newcomer's voice called out from the desert street. Though I cannot say I disagree. In fact, I vaguely recall saying something similar to my teachers, oh, so many years ago. Professor Osmond, it was impossible not to recognize the man, even before his silver hair brushed aside the decorative overhang and he stepped to enter the quaint establishment. His aura would precede him, not his aura, but just the feeling of which enveloped him like a personal force field, whispering karmically mysteries, calming puzzles which one could lose hours of the day and still felt like you had learned something. Professor Tai Yang, pleasure to see you outside of the classroom. How long has it been? A decade? 12, 13 years? It had indeed been that long. He had sent the man an invitation to both of his weddings and baby showers and one funeral, but he had never dared come. Tai Yang would not say that he wasn't miffed at that. More or less, yeah. The younger man hooked an arm around both of his daughters, drawing them close to his chest. These are my daughters, Yang and Ruby. Raven and Summer's daughters. Ty flinched as the lanky headmaster did not even try to make believe it was a question. Yes. Ospen sat down in one of the high stools, managing not to look cramped in the small stall, even with his knees so squished up near his chest. He did not even bother to take his eyes off the family of three as a cup of something steamed was set in front of him. He hummed, one hand caressing the ball of his cane, the other on the mug. Ruby. Yes, an elbow from her father. Sir, going back to what you were saying, he seemingly interjected himself in their conversation, not missing a beat and acting like it was the most normal thing in the world. I am inclined to agree with you. I can tell you from my position as headmaster of Beacon that I get any number of pristine applications across my desk, and yet they are lacking because they do not tell me who the students are. Who are they? Who they are? Ruby probably knew what he meant, but decided to ask anyway just to see how the man would answer. Osmond also recognized the unurgency, did not respond right away. Instead, he turned to a bowl which had been placed in front of him without his having to order, and deliberately lifted a clutch of steaming noodles from his bowl with a pair of the plastic chopsticks from the little holster on the counter. He considered the strands for a moment, put them in his mouth, chewed, and then swallowed, and then he answered. I want to know what kind of people I am accepting to my academy. He pulled a single noodle out. Are they smart? Are they impulsive? Are they orderly? Are they loners? Are they brave? Are they just? Are they loyal? Ruby grew more concerned as the conversation went on. She didn't understand why. It was irrational. It was a feeling akin to that fear of the unknown, and so she repressed it in favor of seeing where this new experience was going until she could tell whether or not she should be afraid. And how can you tell? He laughed, a reserved patter that was like the rapping of fingers on oak. That is much harder. If it were not, they would try to give you grades for it. Ain't that the truth? Tyan grumbled to himself, reluctantly doling out the plastic currency for his family's lunch and sneakingly nosy glances at his daughter's conversation. He had no reason to be nervous, at least he shouldn't. Osmond was a man that he had trusted for years during his own education, and there was little question he would do the same good job with his daughters. This private one-on-one with his youngest only helped cement that fact. The professor should have been happy that his daughter was so appealing to the eccentric headmaster. Regardless, the man spoke up again, pushing away the empty bowl they had never seen him finish. Whether we like it or not, grades are still used by many people nowadays to determine our path in life. It is best if we strive to get the best ones as possible, because that will give us the most options down the line. Ruby nodded dutifully, not feeling much better even having the headmaster of Beacon Academy agree with her. He had told her nothing, given her nothing except his tacit approval, and from his posture it was very clear he wasn't going to let anything slip this time. However, he spoke up quietly, so much so that even in that tiny space she might have been the only one to hear him. Well, her and Naruto. I am certain that the people who matter, the ones you want to think the best of you, will be able to see the real you no matter what lies between. You think? Yes, I do. He handed a few transactional plastic bars to the old man behind the counter and turned to leave, giving her an enigmatic smile. Because the people who are wise know that we are truly defined by our actions. So, be sure that you study hard and continue to do well in your studies. He finished off in a normal volume, flicking his eyes to the mistrustful father and giving him a cool smile. Both her dad and sister shot her inquisitive looks as Aspen left his seat and wandered out into the busy summer's days. Oh, and before I forget, he popped his head back in, startling the three of them who thought they felt him walk off. Congratulations, Miss Rose! And like the gypsies, he was gone, and a cold chill shook her spine with those parting words. Oh wow! Yang gushed, beating out at her father. Oh man, I can't believe we got to meet the Professor Ospin. Damn, why did I have to be so awkward? For some reason, I could hardly talk. I was like you on the first day of school. No offenses. None taken, he replied in a slight daze. Today was certainly fuller of unexpected things than she anticipated. Taiyang watched his two daughters banter as normal, the celebrity conversation just another fad topic to be exhausted by dinner time. But even though he held his questions of curiosity for now, he would not soon forget the happenstance encounter, if it could be deemed such a thing. First Crow, and now Ozpin himself. Taiyang did not know what was going on, and for the first time in a long time, he was scared. Naruto didn't know what to think about this man Ozpin. For once, he did not try to actively judge during the encounter, and instead listened with rapt attention. The fact the man's presence alone could make him do so was strange, but the vibe was something so different he couldn't define it, and yet he could equate it. It wasn't the first time he compared Ozpin to the Hokage. Of course, back then it was the idea of the man rather than his face. He tried to diverse his association in his mind, separate fact from opinion, and just filter out the man's words to Ruby. But that wouldn't be doing it justice, because it was clear to Naruto that Ozpin had picked the sense of the discussion. It was just too big of a coincidence that both he and Gigi chose to have conversations associated with food, worming their way into their hearts through their stomachs. Everything from his cheerful, constructed demeanor to his blunted steel eyes was intentional. The current mistrust of Ozpin as an outsider crept into his option of the old man throughout to spoil it. There was he in need of a wake-up call. Was the Hokage as manipulative as he suspected the headmaster to be, or was he blowing the both of them out of proportion? Uncertainty was not in his nature. It was something he'd had to live with for some time now. Too much was unknown in his strange life. But again, the similarities kept cropping up, too numerous to be unconnected, too obvious to ignore. Though what to do with them he had no idea, nor had he any idea where he was going. He should have been headed to the training grounds to take advantage of the month of the finalities were given to improve their repertoires. He should have been doing what he had during the mission to Wave, training day and night more rigorously if he could manage it. But after all that had happened, he could not focus on training right now, despite the self-talk to the contrary. It still felt futile to work himself all on his own. Yamato had resolved not to favor either of his two teammates, and so would not train either one. Both he and Ruby agreed the shrewd man was not trying to be impartial and simply waiting to see what they would do for themselves. And that was the question. Without the more experienced ninja to help him, he was not convinced in the effectiveness of practicing what he already knew. Both he and Ruby had hit a plateau, even with Crow's intense care. it would take a miracle to get them over the next stump. The depraved giggle seemed to mock him, and he looked up from the ground for the first time since leaving his house. Oi, what are you staring at, brat? Naruto glanced away, avoiding the piercing stare of the massive man who had stopped writing in his notebook to peer over the cover at him. Nothing, sorry. The intensity of the look was disturbing him. It had been a long while since he had to worry about the hatred from the villagers. Ever since he won his headband, this sensation worried him, but for a different reason. Again, one he could not quite place. He averted his eyes and shoved his hands into his pockets and made to move on and ignore the pervasive giggling at the back of his neck. There was no reason to be afraid. He was a ninja after all, and he could handle himself. Thus, it was only with half shock that he found his body flickered out of the way as a blue ball of energy drove through his after image. Heh, not bad, Gaki. Naruto was wary of this man, though ironically less worried now than he had been. He knew how to deal with someone attacking him as his hand drifted to the scythe strapped around his hip. Good instincts. That's enough for now, though. Come on. The strange man tucked his brush and notebook away in a hidden pocket in his haori, beckoning Naruto with a stout finger. Let's go somewhere to talk. This was yet another new experience, something that he didn't know how to deal with. It may have been a mistake, but he hopped off the roof and trailed a few steps behind the equally large shadow. Only time and understanding would tell if this was a good decision to follow the mysterious man or not. So many new people and new situations for him to parse through. Why did they all have to have silver hair though? It just felt too much like the fate Neji kept harping on about. End of chapter 12.